Felix is here, Crystal, and looks like gang's all here. We got Kirk and we got Jeff. And okay, let's go ahead. Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the Community and Economic Development Committee for November 4th. Mandy, can you do the roll?
Yes. Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
And then for other assembly members, Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Ms. Quinn Davidson? Ms. Zalatel? Chair, you have a quorum.
All right, thank you. So we have the agenda before us. Any changes to the agenda from anyone? Hearing nothing. We will stick with it as it is. And we had a nice discussion with Kirk Rose from the Anchorage Community Land Trust at our previous meeting, and he sent us a document that went through a variety of things for that would help out small, agriculture or garden people or people who are doing gardening, how to sell their stuff and get into the business and quite a bit easier. So I wanted to go through that since it was such a nice presentation, pretty clear, and see if there's something in there that we could do. So we've got from the Health Department, Jeff Hickman, and I saw another name down there too.
This is Darcy Harris. I'm the program manager for the environmental health section.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for being here. And then I contacted Michelle McNulty with the planning department because some of these things would be Title 21 issues that would be at the end of the document. So hopefully someone will show up at some point. We could look at some of those things too. So I think to start, maybe we just go down the document, section by section. So Kirk, are you, is this something that we should put on the screen? It's loaded on the committee's website. Can you put it on the screen, or maybe Kirk, you want to work your way down it? Can you put it on the screen? What works best here?
Thank you, Chair Welton. Well, we've got our 8-page document that we sent out, but then we yesterday, I think, included in the packet at just over 1 page, and I can throw that one up on the screen. I'm happy to make a very brief presentation on each of these items, and I've got my colleagues Radhika Krishna and Nick Bachman with me, and I think the time is best spent in your questions. So if that format sounds good, very swift run through these items and go from there.
Okay. Oh, this is, yeah. So I called this up. I didn't realize this was different. So this is much more streamlined. The presentation on the other one was very good, though. I think it made your case real well. Well, so let's go ahead and, okay, so we can go through this 1 page then. And is that, can you put that up, or is?
I can, or if Mandy could, that's a little bit helpful for me too.
Sure, I'll put it up.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go ahead if that sounds all right.
Yeah, go ahead, Kirk.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It's nice to be with you. Like I said, I'm joined by my colleagues, Nick Bachman and Radhika Krishna, and it's nice to be back by invitation and to be with you in consecutive weeks. So thanks for listening and for your time. Like I said, I'd like to move swiftly because I think the time is best spent in your questions. So we send out an 8-page memo that goes pretty in depth on these items, but we've also pulled up this summary policy memo. And what I'd like to do is illuminate a couple of examples. But before I get too far, I want to thank community staff who we worked with on all these items. They're resoundingly always looking for ways to improve and have been very good about hearing us out. We bring this knowledge as practitioners. We don't pretend to be policy experts, so I want to provide that caveat from the top. This is just what we've learned working in this space with entrepreneurs through our different programs. So These are issues that we've run into and confronted numerous times, and we think that they're onerous, stunting, potentially chilling for small business owners and their initiatives. And we all know time is money, and we don't want to have a small business development regime in our city that is cost prohibitive or overall challenging for entrepreneurs. So that's the advantage that we bring today. I'll go through these 3 items that we've brought very quickly, like I said. So from the top, Cottage Foods. This is described in more depth in the 8-page memo, but I just want to provide one example that I think is interesting to note here that kind of illuminates the core issue. So if you're a home-based baker and you're refining your product line in an effort to scale and expand, let's say one week you're making banana bread, but then you realize that, gosh, I've got grandma's cherry bread, and that's really the thing I should be bringing to market. To sell a new product mid-season, you have to submit a recipe and await review from the Anchorage Health Department. Anchorage Health Department has been committed to speeding up this review time, but it still can be challenging for entrepreneurs, especially in an exceptionally short market season. Think about farmers markets in Alaska, that's like July to maybe September, right? And that's your window for making revenue. And to have that shortened in any way can be incredibly challenging while you're awaiting review. Just to illuminate this for our Anchorage body, in the rest of the state, the business owner would not have to await review and can sell non-hazardous products immediately as long as guidelines and best practices are followed. So that's what we're saying when we mean reactive system versus a sort of proactive system. If we scroll down a little bit more to the next question on permitting fee structures for events, just want to highlight another example that we've got for you here that we think is sort of paradigmatic. If you're a taco stand trying to find the right market in your first year of operation, let's just say that we're at Assemblymember Dunbar's favorite market, the Muldoon Market, and this taco vendor gets a seasonal permit for that location. That costs $230. Well, maybe they realize that the market on 15th in Assemblymember Constance District is better, or something they want to try just to experiment for their small business. Well, they go to this Midtown market and they get a temporary permit for $35. In order to sell a second time at the Midtown market on 15th, they need to get another seasonal permit for $230. We see this pattern and the challenges around it because it puts a chilling effect on entrepreneurs who want to try and experiment with different locations in order to create more revenue. It basically just adds significant overhead costs for new businesses, which are really operating at a very, very small scale where a couple $100 permit can be the difference between trying new markets, bringing your products new places across our city, or not going to market at all. So we've seen this particular fee structure be very challenging for small scale entrepreneurs who frankly can't fork over that kind of money. Lastly, we operate, if we could scroll down just a little bit more, Mandy, please. Thank you again. We operate our urban farm, Grow North Farm, and have seen and worked through some zoning challenges on our site and have looked at the commercial horticulture regime in our city. At the end of the day, we believe that commercial horticulture is a use that is productive for spaces in the interim, and it should be something that could be, this designation could be more permissive or more permitted throughout, especially commercial zoning regimes. We don't think that the use is going to be overwhelming or not put that space into productive or prohibit that space from being in productive use long term. We think it's a great interim use to activate parcels that have gone underused and We have looked at and seen regimes that are more permissive for this kind of use across the lower 48. So we recognize that these zoning questions are longer term and need more thinking, but we wanted to put this on the table for consideration. So with that, again, we provided you a lot of information. I think the time is best spent in questions. I will be answering some, but hoping for support from my colleagues, Radhika and Nick, who are on this call as well. So thank you again.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kirk. It's a good overview. So I think next would be to the health department. So I don't know if that's Darcy or Jeff.
That'll
look this stuff before and maybe give us a recap of where you are on it and some of your thoughts.
So the reason why we have the upfront permitting and the state does not is the state logistically can't make it work. So as much as they would like to regulate cottage food, they can't because they have 500,000 square miles to regulate and about 30 inspectors. So they can't get out to Kotzebue and check the cottage foods like, and that's a problem we don't have here in Anchorage. So we're being proactive, and that makes it easier for people to get into the business, to not have to worry about when they're out at the market, are they compliant or not, because they're compliant ahead of time. If we were to change this and take away the requirement to have a license, then what that's going to do is increase our workload dramatically, as every time we go to the market and we see a cottage food vendor, we're going to have to stop and check the cottage food vendor, verify the products they're selling are non-potentially hazardous. We're going to have to ask for all of their lab reports that they're going to have to keep with them, which they currently don't because we've approved those ahead of time. And we're going to have to verify that the products they have are actually not potentially hazardous. And then and so we're basically going to have to inspect them every time we see them, which when they have a license, we walk by the table, we see the license, check for this is an inspected product sign, and we don't even bother them. And off we go and continue the work that we need to do with the temporaries that are out there. And the food trucks. So from our standpoint, the permitting system is a way to make, or the licensing system is a way to make it easier for people to get into business and to know that they're legal. And we have had people submit recipes before and do the testing, and it comes up as as potentially hazardous or TCS food. So which means they can't sell it. But if we didn't do that requirements ahead of time, what the state finds is that oftentimes when they find them in the field that they don't have their food sample stuff and they haven't even done that. And so they don't even know if the product is safe or not. And so then they have to force them to do that. And then they're doing a reactive setup instead of a proactive setup. So and a good example would be something like kefir. We allow kefir to be sold, but only certain formulations of it. And people do try to submit the formulation that uses dairy, and you can't do that. So you have to use like coconut water instead. So there's products that can be made one way and it's safe, and another way and it's not. And so that's what we're doing, is we're reviewing those recipes and those test results to make sure that what they're selling is okay. And we've seen cake and all kinds of stuff come through where they use ingredients in cake that make the cake not safe after it's cooked even. So you would never think that a cake could be potentially not safe at room temperature until you do those two basic tests that are required. So that's why we do what we do, and we require that if they want to change their recipe significantly, that they update, send us an updated recipe list, and if it requires a test, and the test results, and then we can approve those really quickly. So where we run into the snags is when they turn in an application, but they don't submit all the paperwork or all of the recipes or all of the testing, if testing is required. Not every product is required to be tested. Obviously, if you have a cookie, cookies are pretty safe, so we don't require testing for cookies. And we have a good list that we took from the state. We mirror the state exactly as to what's allowed and not allowed, and what has to be tested and not tested. In fact, we use their forms. We just changed the name on the top pretty much. So and so our requirements and the state requirements are identical, except we require that you prove it up front, and the state only requires that you prove it when they inspect you in the field. So, and if we change the system, then we would be doing like the state, we would be inspecting in the field, and except with us, we inspect every event or nearly every event. So we would probably spend a significant more amount of time with the vendor and with our inspectors inspecting Cottage Foods, which is something we currently don't want to do. So
Interesting. So for the committee members, I'm watching the chat here. So if you have questions, go ahead and just ask in the chat. And something pops in, and I guess I don't go to Kirk and others, but maybe you could walk through more carefully. It might be familiar to others, but suppose I have I guess a cake. You know, I have a great cake. Everyone says, "Oh, I love this. You should sell it at a market." What do I do? That's to Jeff.
Nick, do you want to jump in? Or
do you want me to answer this one, or do you want? Normally, the process would be is that if they have a product they want to sell, they can go to our website, get the application. They can call us, and we'll answer all the questions that they have. Tell them exactly what paperwork they need to turn in. If they have an idea of the products they want to sell, we can tell them pretty much up front if that product needs to be tested or not based on what it is. And then if it needs to be tested, we can give them the information for the state lab, which it's $30 if you have to have both tests, or I think it's $20 for the water activity and 10 for the pH or something like that. So, you don't always need both tests depending on what it is you're trying to sell. So, and if they do all of that ahead of time and they bring us the recipe list and any testing that's required and the application for a cottage food license, then that can be turned around in just a few days. Where the problems come in is when they submit a recipe and they don't submit the recipe, or they don't submit the testing, and then we have to go back and tell them, well, for this product you need to test it, or we need the ingredients or whatever, and then they take a week or 2 or 3 weeks to get back to us, and then we tell them, well, you still got to get it tested, and then they take another couple of weeks for that, and they come back and say it takes forever to get approved, but it's really because they're not very fast. And so we can only turn it around as fast as we receive the information. So, and Cottage Foods are typically pretty simple. There's no real plan review process with them like a restaurant. We don't have to look at nearly the great detail that we would for a normal facility. So the turnaround is fast. I believe the procedure for the plan reviewer is that those go to the top of our list so that they get turned around fast, so that they're pushed up in front of restaurants, so that way they're not sitting in a queue for a month. So, and so we try to turn those around as quick as we can.
Okay, we got a question, Crystal.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My question is kind of in regard to is there a distinction between the licensing for these markets compared to doing something like a craft bazaar at one of the local elementary schools? And also just a typical PTA bake sale. You know, we don't do any kind of licensing for that. So can you explain to me then if there is a difference between like doing a local Christmas craft bazaar versus one of the markets? And then what do you do about PTA bake sales?
Through the chair, basically, if they've got a cottage food license, they can vend at any market, any bazaar, anywhere that they have permission to sell. And that's the nice thing about the license. With the bake sales, there is a very specific exemption for the occasional bake sale for a fundraiser. So those are actually specifically exempt as long as the products are non-potentially hazardous or non-TCS, non-time temperature controlled for safety. So as long as they stick to cookies, cakes that don't have meringue filling and stuff that has to be refrigerated, then that's fine. And so that's why PTA bake sales, the youth group selling cookies at the Saturday market for 1 or 2 weeks, or out in front of the church car wash, those are all fine without permits as long as the key is occasional. When it becomes a business, then you need the cottage food license.
Okay, all right. Well, that helps. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
But as you follow up on that, Jeff, is when you say occasional, is that the event is occasional or the seller just occasionally does it?
The sale is occasional. So if you're doing it, 2 or 3 times over the course of the summer to raise funds for your church youth group, that's okay. But if you're doing it every week, then it's really not a fundraiser anymore. Now it's a business and you should get the cottage food license.
Okay. Oh, maybe. Sorry. And I see, Darcy, you've got your hand up. I'll watch the chat a little bit more for getting in the queue, Darcy, though. I see that. Why don't you go ahead, Darcy? You're silent, Darcy.
I apologize for that. Thank you, Chair Wilton. To your question about process, I wanted to also say that when we met with ACLT back in, I believe it was February, when they initially had some questions for us, we were able to talk with them about some of the needs from their customers and some of the things that they saw as the main hurdles. So we could proactively work with their group to provide information to their customers in whatever way they seemed to feel was the best way, so that their customers could come to our process with a complete package and expedite the whole process. And they weren't, we weren't waiting on things because they would show up with the entire package complete. And we, in a proactive effort, we did work with the Small Business Development Center at UAA and produce a free online webinar for the process of applying for and receiving and going through the whole cottage food process within the municipality. And that is available through the Small Business Development Center. So we have worked with ACLT for, making sure that they knew that that was out there, and we produced it partially in response to some of their questions.
Okay, and has that worked?
We haven't gotten a lot of feedback, but I hope that people are utilizing it.
I'm sorry, and how long has that been up?
We finished that in March or April last year, or maybe, yeah, we got back, I think it was April. Yep.
Of 2020?
21.
Oh, sorry, this is Kirk with ACLT. So, absolutely, that partnership is wonderful and appreciated. I will say that it still means a fair bit of technical assistance on our side, and that's just time and energy that my staff puts into these things to make sure that there's a pretty package to present to the municipality. So obviously not every entrepreneur has access to that, and without a partner in the field who's doing the work day to day, hour to hour with entrepreneurs, really, a fair bit of these applications are not coming with that kind of packaging. But we're obviously very appreciative of HD for our partnership and for that ability to expedite. But I think overall, the system doesn't really work that way.
So Kirk, maybe you could walk us through. So you have, what is a typical person who you would deal with? Is it someone who just bakes something, then their friends say it's great, you should sell it, and things go from there? What would, just walk us through an example?
Yeah, and I might turn it to Nick on my team, and I see his hands up too.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to an example. Sometimes it can be English language learners who are going through that process, but often it'll just be somebody who's interested, might not have a high level of tech literacy or ability to access the cottage food licensing process. I'll note that, when I think in-person visits were more the norm pre-COVID, we probably had a bit more ease, but through the technical elements of working online a lot more, I think there's just increased the barrier to entry for some folks. And I would say, yeah, so we've had bakers or people doing simple pickled goods that are trying to sell at market. and going through the process of technical assistance, it is, a few hours of work, and that did add up through the busy early season. But I think that was meaningful time spent, and those folks did learn from that process. And I want to say, like, the click-through diagram and some of the improvements made from the HD has made that process easier year over year as a technical assistant provider. One element of it is that I think Kirk spoke to in the beginning is really that ability to pivot mid-season. And say if somebody's gone through the process, gotten some feedback from the AHD, and now they're an approved cottage food licensed applicant, if there is some way for them to be able to say, yeah, I'm making a carrot bread and now beets are in season, and I want to see how that's going to do at market, to not have to submit a new recipe for even similar products, or if there's the kind of elements of threshold for non-hazardous goods where some need to be tested, some don't need to be tested. If there's even within the products that need to be tested, a way for people to move forward and try and pivot throughout the season to really refine their product in that early time in their careers.
Okay, so what is the testing then? Do they actually make the cookie and bring it somewhere?
So the testing is, and AHD, feel free to speak more here, but it's for an acidity. It's like a pH test is the primary testing that needs to be done if things have a certain amount of liquid content, I believe.
So hi, this is Jeff again. Basically, the tests are required for some things, like if you're going to do kefir or something, then there's two different tests that can be done, and always, you don't always need both depending on the product. But one is the pH test, because code requires that it be below, I believe, 4.6, or I'd have to reference the code just to make sure my numbers are right, but it's somewhere around 4.6. And below, it's acidic enough that nothing will grow into it. So that, like a salsa, for instance. So if you're going to make salsa, we would want to make sure that the pH in that is below 4.6. And you'd say, oh, salsa is pretty acidic, but depending on which tomatoes you use, not all tomatoes anymore are acidic. So some of the new types of tomatoes are not acidic enough. So we'd have to make sure that the product met the threshold to be considered safe. And for other products, you might need the water activity. The water activity has to be, I forget what the exact number is without referencing the code, but it has to be below that threshold, because if there's a high amount of water in the product, then the product can support bacterial growth. And so then it's not a safe product to have sitting on the table all day. And some products, we need to have a combination of water activity and pH to be considered safe. So, and like I said, we have a pretty good list of products that require, that show which things need to be tested and which things don't. Like, as I said before, things like cookies and dry baked goods, the risk is so low that the testing's not required. But if you're making a cake, but you're using butter or cream or buttercream or meringue or something like that, then depending on how you make that, or the products that you use to come up with that stuff, it could end up to be not safe when it's cooked. It might need to be refrigerated, like a cheesecake or a pumpkin pie, or something like that. So we would require the water activity testing to verify that those products are safe. And we have found that people do have their favorite recipe and find that they're surprised that the water activity is too high, and then they have to alter their recipe or come up with a different product. So, but some of that stuff you'd never know if you don't test it.
Okay, so they actually make the item then and bring it to a place to get tested.
Yeah, the Department of Environmental Conservation has the Environmental Health Lab, and they offer that testing to the public at below what it costs them to run the test. So they're offering it for both tests for $30. One, I think the water activity test is $20, and the pH test is $10. So so the test is very inexpensive. Unless you have 47 products that you have to be tested. But even then, if you have 10 kinds of cakes and they're all basically the same, but one is carrot and one is beets, then we'll just let you do one, because if everything else in the cake is the same thing, but the vegetable is different, then your results are not going to really be any different. So we're not going to make somebody test 13 variations of the same cake. We're just going to make them test one variation and make sure that all the main ingredients are safe. So, and that goes with just about any product where people want to do variations of the same product. We're not going to make them test all of them just because that gets really expensive. And the results won't be any different between the different products anyway.
Okay. So addressing the point that Kirk made, where they may switch they want to go from carrots to beets midstream. I mean, they could, if they planned ahead and knew that the market might change or.
Well, if they decided they wanted to do that, they could just submit the recipe and then we would just approve it. Because if we see, oh, they've already got the cake and every ingredient is the same except they're switching this ingredient for that one, and we know that that ingredient is fine, then we're not going to make them retest that. We're just going to say, yep, you're approved, and send it and update their license. So that's pretty simple. It's when they decide they want to do like a whole different product, like they're selling kefir and they realize, oh, we want to do kombucha, then they're going to have to go through the whole testing process. But if they did that ahead of time and sent it to us all with the testing results and the recipe, then we would just approve it, pretty quick. So there wouldn't be a very large lag there.
Okay.
I'd also like to point out too, if we remove the licensing requirement, the onus on the person doing it is no different. So they still have to have exactly the same thing they would have to have as a license. So if there's a barrier or a learning problem or not understanding, it's not going to change. It's still going to be the same exact requirements. The difference is we'll check it every time we're in the field versus checking it up front and then not bothering them anymore.
So Kirk, is the license the barrier then?
I agree with Jeff on that point. But I think the idea that there's a trust-based system where entrepreneurs are bringing products and they're asking to be verified, in the field to back it up is actually better for the entrepreneur, and in our opinion, in our experience on the street, than having to work through the process up front, because it allows them to bring a product to market sooner rather than I think waiting through this permitting process up front. And and you all are hearing the points, I think, on our side of the table and on their side of the table. And I guess I'd just say that the rest of the state of Alaska is operating in this more trust-based system, and I think it's actually challenging economic development in Anchorage to do it the way that we're doing it. So yeah, I agree with Jeff on all respects though, and I want to affirm, and I wrote this in the chat, like we absolutely are working towards compliance and safety every day. That's the number one point. But I think the permitting process in the front versus in the field is the core question.
Okay, Felix, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions. One for the health department. So, it's a little bit difficult to compare our practices to the state and then our practice to other jurisdictions because of our health powers. But I'm wondering if you could compare our practice to other jurisdictions in the lower 48. And then second question is to Kirk or anyone at ACLT. So in your memo, you talked about a specific example, I think, with Catholic Social Services. And so I think just to ground this in a little bit of real world context, could you walk through the specific issues which caused that? I think it was like a 3-month delay for the approval there. So those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
What is that to Kirk?
One is
I'm happy
to
to jump in a
and
bit
one
there.
is to ACLT.
Did you? Okay, who wants to go first? Jeff, do you want to compare with other cities?
Well, we did a lot of research on this, and there's guidelines produced by AFTO, the Food and Drug officials that put out guidance, and we kind of based some of our stuff on that. But a lot of states actually are far more strict than Alaska. Alaska is one of the most lax states for cottage food there is, other than maybe Wyoming or Idaho. But like in Texas, for instance, you can't sell any fermented products, no pickles, no anything, no kefir, no kombucha, because all that stuff is if a restaurant wanted to sell pickles, they would have to have a HACCP plan followed by a variance in order to sell pickles or yogurt or anything else that was made in a fermented or cured, cured meats and stuff. But I guess that's not part of cottage food. But any fermented product like pickles or kimchi or any of that kind of stuff would have to go through a HACCP plan and variance in order for a restaurant to sell the exact same product we allow cottage foods to do with no permit at all, essentially. So as far as being lax, we're very unrestrictive in what we allow cottage foods to sell. And a lot of states, most of the states, in fact, don't allow probably half of the stuff that Alaska does. So in that regards, I think we're very cottage food friendly compared to many states. So I think Wyoming doesn't have any rules at all, but that's one of the only states that doesn't have any cottage food, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't know if Wyoming has since enacted any cottage food regulations, but so that was our experience, is that what we were doing. And so we are following the state as far as what products are allowed or not allowed, so that we have no conflict between, because back before we had cottage foods and we were doing this with a variance process, our rules were different than the state, and it caused a lot of problems. So we decided to adopt the same rules as the state, so that there's no difference between here and there, other than we do the licensing up front. The state checks when you're in the field. But again, the process to start selling is no different if you get a license or don't get a license. You still have to have the exact same paperwork filled out. You still have to have the exact same testing. You still have to have all the same recipes. So, except you have to carry them with you every time you sell. So when we license them, they don't have to carry their test results, their recipes and everything with them. All they have to do is carry the little piece of paper that says they've got a license, and then that's a lot easier for us to check and for them to remember to bring.
Okay. Felix, you got a follow up on that?
No follow up on that, but happy to hear from ACLT.
Okay. And Kirk or other for, I guess, a kind of example that you made with.
Thank you. Yeah, Nick Bachman's going to take this one. Thanks.
Yep. Hey, folks. Nick Bachman here. Just to introduce myself a bit more, I'm the food and farm manager with ACLT. I work on the ground a lot doing technical assistance with food businesses, and I help a lot with the operations and kind of event organizing at Grow North Farm. And I've worked a ton with the Catholic Social Services team on their Fresh International Gardens program to help them do some product development and general business planning. And so, yeah, in 2019, I believe there was just, I was newer to the city and helping that team get some pickled radish products together. When you have a surplus or anything like that of a product, it can be really beneficial and, economical to pickle it and bring it to market in that fashion. Has a long shelf life. And they experienced significant holdback over that time to get the kind of testing approved, I believe, and have the permit allowed through. I would say, in that time since, there's been a lot of impressive work that's gone on from the health department to be more prompt and timely, and that delay to that extent hasn't been experienced by another entrepreneur or a group of entrepreneurs that I've worked with since then. And I know there are some other questions on this one. I think that main point around pivoting product and other things are really important. And I'm happy for us to spend more time there. I have been thinking about how the permitting within the 2021 market season, kind of that next big point, really created some much more significant barriers. And that could be a good one that if we could try to pivot some time toward that point.
We'll I guess maybe a little bit more on that then, Nick. So in 2021, is that because of COVID and they couldn't go into the office, or what were the issues there?
Apologies. I think I used the term permitting it too loosely. I actually was kind of referring to the second point on the memo that we'd put together about the permitting fee structure and the temporary license structure and the seasonal permit structure. But I'm very happy to spend more time within the cottage food stuff. And thank you to Jeff and Darcy for some of their clarification about how they think differently from the state solution to the city solution. I've sat with the Alaska Food Policy Council team, and I think seeing how there's been progress made on how to refine and improve the cottage food licensing within the state and maybe make next steps, thinking about like adapting to online sales or anything like that. It feels like Anchorage can often be isolated and kind of the outlier in thinking about how to progress within those early stage folks because our licensing system is different. Though, you know, at market on paper, everyone's showing up with the same thing. Having that licensing and other system in front of it creates a change in the way that we participate in those conversations. It's kind of one of the other elements of why thinking about going to the state system would be quite meaningful and beneficial. But hearing what they're saying around how doing multiple booth visits during everything would actually possibly increase how much work they'd have to be doing in the field, I hear that and understand that as well.
Okay, thanks. Do you follow up on that, Felix?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Crystal, you had a question?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is probably, directed to the health department, even though it may not be one that they can answer. But I was just curious if there's really kind of two different systems that function in the state versus with the municipality. Are there any more, is there any more prevalence to actual health incidents where faulty products or dangerous products were actually sold and people were harmed by that with using the state system? I mean, do we have any data that says that how a particular process actually helps protect the general public better? So anyway, I don't know if there's any actual data that might clarify that, but go ahead. If anybody's got an answer, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
Hi, through the chair. I don't have any data from the state, but I do know that on occasion they do get complaints, and then they have to go address the complaints with Cottage Food, and we have not had any complaints from the public about our Cottage Food. So, and the state often will come up, and when you allow people to determine whether or not their product is safe without somebody looking over the data, people will say their product is safe, but they won't have gotten the testing. They won't follow the process, and the state does spend time trying to get people to fix their products when they're selling things that aren't safe. And so that's a difference between doing it up front and then trying to catch people in the field and stopping it. And so you would, I know we would spend quite a bit of time trying to correct people who haven't had the test done or selling products they think are safe, but they aren't. And they don't have any pH test or water activity to back that up. And so then we would have to shut them down until they got the test and showed us that their products were safe. And so we just eliminate all of that up front by having them do everything up front and show it to us. And then we know it's done. We know it's safe. They know it's safe. The public doesn't need to worry then. When you don't have a system of proactive licensing, then you get what you have in the state, whereas I determine that the moose meat that I've got is okay. It's dehydrated, it's safe at room temp, right? But the code specifically says you can't sell meat, but they haven't read the code, so they don't know that. So, and then we have to go there and then shut it down and stop it and go through all of that. So that's just why we set it up that way in the first place. And the municipal attorney helped write a lot of that stuff when we did the emergency ordinance to make it legal before we passed the updated food code that allowed cottage foods. So we did a lot of work and a lot of research into doing it the way we've done it, so that way we can make sure it's as safe as possible with the lowest overhead and the least amount of government interference in their life.
Okay, thank you. But you can actually say that the municipality hasn't had any complaints about any of the cottage foods
We
that
can
have
say
been licensed. Great,
Yes.
thank you.
yes, but I can't speak for the state. I don't know if they've
Sure.
had complaints or problems, because they don't, we don't regularly communicate on issues like that.
Okay, all right, no, fair enough. That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Crystal. Chris?
Thanks. So this is an area that creates some difficulty for me, and I'm pulled in multiple directions. So I want to support the cottage industries to be able to be as flexible and easy to get into the business as possible. But I happen to have been really close friends with the Director of Environmental Health at the Department of Environmental Conservation at the time when the state changed from actually sending out food inspectors into the field in the state to a system where you just fill out a form online and we trust you, and then if there's a problem they come out and they basically don't do any inspections at the state, where functionally speaking it became kind of a lottery outside of Anchorage about whether you were going to have safe food. And this is not for cottage foods, this is just foods in general. And when this conversation hit the legislature, because there was a proposed bill to basically do away with all food inspections, and a state representative wanted to make a point. And so that representative brought strawberries from her farm that she wanted to show people that the rules that we have are making it so I can't just come out and sell my products from my little tiny farm. And while she was doing that, it was all on video. And it became an international sensation on the BARF blog. The BARF blog is the food safety blog that the National Food Safety regulators share information on, where this state legislator was literally scratching her hair and even her butt, and then using that same hand to provide other legislators strawberries so they could eat, while making the argument, there's no problem here. Look, these are my farm-made goods and they're safe. And that was really shocking and really telling. And so I want us to be very careful not to walk down a path where we move to a position where we as a municipality don't inspect food products, and we put it into a position of trust that the people are going to do the right thing. So when previously I'd heard conversations about the idea of, well, what about we just, for say these 5 different farms that this cottage food vendor wants, they can only be reviewed once or reviewed annually with inspections. Streamlining and simplifying it makes a lot of sense to me. I am hesitant to go away from having that really clear upfront review by the department so that we can ensure to the public that these goods are safe. And so I'm really torn, because I want to promote robustly the farmers in my neighborhood and the vendors who are making great stuff to get their great stuff as easily as possible to the market, but I don't want to sacrifice the safety that we have. And so I want to make sure whatever path we might move down, we're very clear about ensuring the public health in the process.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Is there any comments on that from Health Department or Kirk?
Hi, this is Jeff. I just would like to say that after you get your first permit, renewing the permits are just a matter, as long as everything is not changed, you just basically just send in the recipes again, and we just verify that they're not changed, and you just get your permit for $25. So there's no arduous process for renewal. Basically, we send you a bill, you pay the bill, and it's done. Now, if you've changed something, then we'll have to update your recipes just like you would if you tried to do it mid-season. But other than that, it's pretty simple to renew.
I mean, I understood, though, that if they did the Spenard Farmers Market, it was one set of fees. And if they did then the Mountain View, it's one set of fees. And if they did
different thing. So
You know,
cottage food is a license that's good anywhere inside the municipality, anywhere you want to sell it. It's the temporary permits, which is a different item. Temporaries are a higher level of permit than cottage food. So that's a whole different thing than what we're talking about right now.
so I just want to make sure we are aiming to streamline the process and make it more affordable for people, and at the same time, not sacrifice the public health.
With cottage food right now, it's pretty streamlined as it can be. The temporary food thing is a whole different discussion. Temporaries are your guy selling pulled pork sandwiches, the church group doing, hamburgers and hot dogs at the 4th of July on the park strip. That's a whole different level of permit. That's a lot more regulations involved with that than cottage food. So there's a whole different permitting structure around temporaries versus cottage food.
Kirk, could we hear from you on that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the next item on our memo that we put together. I just want to affirm what you said, Assemblymember Constant, which is, I think there's 3 priorities here. One, first and foremost, absolutely we agree, is the safety of the consumer. I think second is what's easiest and most efficient for the entrepreneur. And I think thirdly, it's what's easiest and most efficient for the health department in carrying out the review and safety checks. So, there's multiple levels of inspections, and I do think that there are efficiencies in here. The question really, I think, for the committee is, what's the timing of this review and compliance, and is it better to be upfront, or is it better to have inspections in the field? And that's something that we could discuss more. The other thing I'll say, though, is we feel like actually the even more significant issue for chilling or stunting of business is the second item, which relates to the cost of event permitting, which we find to be, I'll say, regressive. And we can dive into that matter a little bit more, but it is separate and distinct from cottage foods.
All right, thank you.
Well, thanks. Well, I see Crystal, you're in on this topic.
Thanks. Yes, I guess just a comment, but it seems to me we could do something with seasonal permits that make it more flexible so that it's not really tied to just any one event, even though it might be that particular event all summer long. But anyway, I guess one of my questions was really how problematic is that to just have a blanket permit? I mean, have we ever looked at anything like that was good, that was good in that way for multiple events, maybe for specific foods, but didn't matter where they actually were selling them at? And then the other question is, don't all these individual markets also, I mean, it's the management of the markets that have a fee as well. You pay a booth rental or lease fee as well. And so that probably gets relatively pricey too, especially if you're doing that for doing the multiple events or multiple times. So anyway, can somebody just kind of speak to the management of these events? And I know it's a little bit off of this topic, but I think it speaks to kind of the cost and some of the paperwork, if you will, that people have to go through in order to be able to participate in these kinds of markets and bazaars. So 2 questions there. Thanks.
Actually, so I think you've jumped to the next category, the permitting fee structure. And I want to, which we can do. So everybody hold on to those questions, I think. So looking at the basic cottage food license, so we're kind of, do we do what the state does or do what the city does? How streamlined is it? It sounds like there's been improvements to make it easier, but it still creates somewhat of a barrier for someone stepping in first time. But then I think from the health department's view too, we want safe food. And probably the worst thing for the whole business would be if there's a rash of people getting sick at some market, who would kind of chill the whole system. So I'm not sure what to do. I mean, at some point, I think we need some follow-up on this to figure out where to go. But I think, Kirk, from you, this is not the main burden. It's a hassle and a bureaucratic deal, but the fees actually gets down to the main issue then, main barrier. Is that correct, Kirk?
Yeah, it all adds up, but I think the fees are actually the number one priority for us today.
Okay, so let me just kind of, I guess, on the cottage food thing. So Jeff, we had done something in the last year or so that changed the cottage food rules, and I think eased them up a little bit, but I forget exactly what that was. Can you recap that?
It was the eggs. We added egg permits so people can sell eggs inside the municipality without having to have a full-on seasonal temporary permit to do that. So now they have a $25 fee, and you can now sell eggs next to your produce with minimal regulations. So that was the thing we passed a few months back.
Okay, so that was good. And then I think prior to that, we did something where it seemed like it lowered the barrier, but they had to put a sign up and say, this is cottage food. And
Yeah, that was back in 2019 when we changed the food code. Because before then it was, or is that 2017, 2018? I forget, whichever year we did the big food code update, 2 food codes ago. We did that. We wrote a temporary ordinance that Bill Falsey wrote up, and then we got that put in place to last until we got the food code change enacted to make it easier for cottage food to exist in Anchorage. Because prior to that point, cottage foods were illegal by our code, and so we needed to change our code to make them legal, and so we have done that. So that was where and cottage foods were paying the same price as a type 1 permit, which was I think $200 a year at the time, and so and had to have a variance fee of another $50 on top of that. So we wrote the temporary ordinance so we could just charge them $25 and have a set of rules that mirrored the state. And then we did the food code change, and then that put it into law permanently.
okay, so that was fairly dramatic to do that.
Yeah, there was quite a few issues between what we were doing through policy versus what the state did, and it was recognized that those measures were not the best, and it was difficult to regulate somebody bringing something in from Wasilla that was legal in Wasilla, and now in Anchorage it's not. So we have mirrored the state just for the ease of crossing jurisdictions. So since Alaska is pretty simple, there's only 2, so we don't have to argue with 10 other counties like some states. So
This stuff back in 17, I mean, did that make seems like that would make a big difference in ease of access.
I don't have a ton of great insight on what that change meant.
Okay. All right, thanks, Jeff. So well, let's go ahead then. I see you in the queue for us. Were you on this topic about the cottage foods, or do you want to move on to permitting?
No, I'd like to stick with cottage foods for a second. Kirk,
Okay,
you mentioned the fees were, perhaps the most prohibitive thing for your startups. Can you remind me again? I'm looking at the policy memo and I see the temporary permit fees, but can you remind me, what are the cottage, I know you said them at the beginning, but what are the cottage industry fees?
Yeah, and that might be a question for HD. I just want to be sure we get it right, or for Nick if he's still on the call. But $25 an application, right, Jeff?
yes, $25 for a cottage food license, and then the testing is between $10 and $30 if you need to test. So per product that has to be tested.
Okay, so I mean that strikes me as not a. I'm sorry, what did you say there, John?
The testing is a state fee. That's not a muni fee. So that's what the lab charges.
Okay, and there's no first time fee, like startup fee?
Nope, just $25 a year, and that's all there is.
Okay.
No fees, no extra. Like if you were a Taco Bell, building a new Taco Bell, we would have a review process, and it would have to go through the building department and health and everybody else to get that building approved and the kitchen approved before you open it. But there's nothing like that for cottage food.
Well, it's interesting that sort of cuts both ways to me. On the one hand, I mean, it just seems like such a small amount that you'd think that that wouldn't be prohibitive for the vendors. I mean, $25 seems really reasonable. On the other hand, that also seems like such a small amount of money that I almost wonder why the municipality is charging at all, right? Because it can't be a significant portion of your budget, right?
No, it's not, and it doesn't even cover the cost of what it costs to generate the license. So it's a fee, it's a minimal fee so that we recover some of the cost of doing this, but it doesn't cover everything.
And I think there's a bit of clarifying there too, because when Kirk was referring to the fees being the number one thing, I believe in that context, we were actually starting to transition to that conversation about the event permitting fees.
Oh, okay. All right.
Which is a range from $130 to $330 for a seasonal permit.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and this is a confusing one where we've, are talking about cottage food license permitting and event permitting, which are just a few lines down from each other on the code and have their own fee structures. From experience as practitioner, the $25 a year for the cottage foods hasn't been too prohibitive for anybody that's trying to participate in that market. They understand that that's a fair price to be paying to get to sell their product through the licensing process. The $230 for the seasonal permits, and I'm using $230 because that's kind of the average generally. It grades by risk type. But $230 for the seasonal permit has definitely caused people to walk away from, multiple people this year that I've interacted with, to walk away from selling opportunities. And that's within the selling like prepared hot foods at market, as opposed to the non-potentially hazardous, which is what the cottage foods are.
Okay, I want to, before we move on to those, it just, we get some things in the chat here that aren't on the recorded record. So Darcy's got in there that it's the licensing fee is $25 per year per product. So, and I guess to clarify on that, Darcy, so if I have two different kinds of cakes, is that, with just, one ingredient change or something, is that $25?
That would not be an additional. If I wanted to make pickles as well as a cake, then those would be two different products. But if I wanted to make cucumber pickles with peppers in them and one without peppers in them, that would be the same product.
Darcy, just for clarity, like if I'm a baker and I'm making focaccia and cornbread muffins and chantilly cake, are those things different products?
Those three recipes would very likely need different testing. Each one would be different enough recipes that they would need their own testing.
Now, I want to clarify, you're talking about testing, Darcy, not licensing, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, those are two different things. So
would that be one license then?
Licensing is what we do at the city, but if you have 5 products that require testing, it could be anywhere between $10 and $30 per product to test it if they're different things. So like I was saying earlier, if you had a cake and it was 99% the same, but you switch carrots for beets, we wouldn't make you test both of those if that if that cake for some reason had something in there that we would say need to be tested. So we would just make you test one of the multiple formulations of the same product. But if you had pickles and cake, then we would have 2 tests, and then you could potentially have between $20 and $60 in tests, depending on what tests you need to have done. So, and that's a state fee, that's not our fee. But there also is nothing in the code that says you can't go buy your own water activity meter and your own pH meter and do it yourself and turn in those results. So most people have the equipment to do that, and buying the equipment is far more expensive than the test. So so most people, in fact, everybody just goes to the state lab because it's about the cheapest place on planet Earth you could get that test done. They have made a hell of a deal so that this can be done for their cottage food and our cottage food. And it's way below what it actually costs them to do that test.
Yeah, Kirk, I must have misunderstood your question.
Well,
No,
so
thank
to
you.
clarify,
Our stacking fees, you're correct.
so if someone makes pickles and cake, is that two different licenses or is just two different tests?
It would be one license, but it could potentially be two different tests because they're two different products.
Yeah.
You know, it's because they're not the same. You know, like I said, if you had one product, and we've had a lot of people do this where they have one product that's essentially 99% the same, but they switch one ingredient in it to make different flavors, and that's fine. We just make them test one of those products, not all of them.
One license per vendor.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got that.
And
Okay,
thank you.
that's
This is
helpful.
just for a little bit of clarity on my comment in the chat, which is about the stacking fees. I only say that because Cottage Foods, by definition, are businesses who are making less than 25,000 in revenue, and the margins are really tight. And these are people who are doing this as a side hustle, as a side gig. It's not their full-time thing, and that's why anything that cuts into their margins or anything that creates more time and process is incredibly onerous, and why we want to focus here, because these are often low income and very diverse entrepreneurs who may have trouble navigating the system as well. So that's why we're really focused here and why these dollar amounts of fees add up.
Okay, all right, thank you. So got Forrest. Okay, and in the chat, Kirk's got a comment on stacking of fees as you get all the variety in there. And Jamie wants Nick to contact her. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on then. So it's 10 o'clock, a little after 10, to the permitting fees then. And Kirk, you want to reintroduce that, or
Sure. I think that the heart of our issue actually, or where entrepreneurs feel, I think, costs and may not take chances or look at different opportunities for their businesses because of the type of event permitting system we have now. There's a table in the 8-page memo which shows how this can be expensive and can also be sort of prohibitive in allowing entrepreneurs to bounce around to different markets. So there's been a wonderful thing that's happened in our city, which is there's been a lot of farmers markets that have blown up, and especially in the last 5 to 7 years. And it's conceivable and understandable that entrepreneurs may try to go from place to place to sell more products, meet more customers, have more exposure for their business. I think our current system of permitting actually makes that really challenging and costly, and that's what we want to broach with this item.
okay. So does Jeff or Darcy want to address that?
The way our fee structure is set up, it's set up so that you can run, in fact, we've actually made it even more generous with the last code revision, because the way it used to be is it was good for 120 days. Now they're good for 180 days. They were also only good for 2 days a week. Now they're good for 3 days a week. So 3 consecutive days. And so we have done, we've tried to make these more usable for a longer period of time. And but again, it's a temporary permit. So the thing with a temporary permit is it's designed for people who are not necessarily restaurant owners, and they don't have the experience of a normal restaurant owner. Many folks don't, and so the entry into this is pretty low. We don't require plumbing. We don't require a booth with floors. You can get by with a barbecue grill and a table and a hand wash container and a catch bucket, and not much more than that. So the idea here is that it's a temporary. It's not meant to be an every week business forever. So if you're going to be an every week business forever, then you probably should get yourself a food truck or a push cart or some other form that's got a higher level of permit. So the reason why a temporary permit is only good at an event one time, like a seasonal market, is because we don't want people to buy a permit every week or every 3 weeks, because We have a 21-day permit, which would get you 3 weekends at a market if you're just trying it for $75. So, and then they buy another 3-week permit and another 3-week permit, and then they've got a permanent business on temporary permits. And you say, wow, that would be crazy expensive. But I can say from experience, I worked previously to Alaska. I was an inspector in the city of Dallas, and they found a loophole in the code there, and temporary vendors were buying basically monthly permits for 12 months a year. Even though the permits were more expensive, the cost of having a permanent business that was, quote, legal was way cheaper than a restaurant. So if you could set up a pop-up tent, a barbecue grill, and a table in a parking lot and sell for 12 months a year, same spot, same location, then you could make a lot of money and not have to deal with the building department, the health department, a fire department, electrical, plumbing, and spend $1 million on a building. So that's why we have it set the way we do, because this is not meant to be a permanent business. This is meant to be a temporary business over a short period of time. This type of thing is not designed to last for months and months and months with the kind of equipment that they're using basically from Home Depot. You know, restaurant equipment, as we know, is very different than home equipment. So, and a lot more expensive. So that's kind of why we have it set that way. And we do have 3 levels of permit for a temporary permit. And one of those is the basic 1-day permit, which is $35. Then we have a 2 to 4 day permit, which is $50. And then we have a 5 to 21-day permit, which is $75. So a 21-day permit could get somebody who wants to see if they want to get into a market, basically 3 weekends to try it out. And before they buy that seasonal permit, which is designed, which we have set up to basically allow people to run out of market. And but it's only good at that one location, and there's reasons for that too. And the reasons is what we find is that if people have permits for more than one spot, then they'll run in 2 spots, and then we'll have problems, or we'll have them at one market because, oh, I have got a permit that lets me run at any market, but it might only be one market at a time, and they'll run at every market with a table. And then we have had that permit problem with push carts back before we had stickers. So making copies of their actual regular permit and running all over town on one permit. So we're trying to keep that stuff from happening and making it hard for us to do our job to keep the public safe.
Thoughts on that, Kirk? Or
Yeah,
Nick?
I think our point is really what Jeff said at the end, which is that the seasonal permits are tied to location, and so you can't transfer. He brought up this, potentially there's businesses operating at all different markets on the same day. I see why that's a problem for the permitting, but let's find a regime that allows that, so that'd be wonderful, in my opinion, if we had businesses operating at all 5 farmers markets. The core issue, though, is the seasonal permit is tied to one location, and we think it should be more location agnostic, allowing one business to operate at whatever market they choose, because we think that to pay this permit fee over and over again, like I said, is cost prohibitive and unnecessary. And if they have been permitted at one location, what's the difference of being at another location? On Jeff's point of businesses operating under a tent and table year round, and sort of in that way being a restaurant, we don't have that issue in Alaska. So I think that's a bit of a moot point. Some might try, but I don't think that they're going to find that they want a food truck or a food cart pretty quick, or their customers are not going to come to them. So those are my responses.
So Jeff, is following up on that. So if someone were to do a morning market, and then, because I think some are like the Spinard markets, I think ends at 1 or 2 or something, and then I think there's a South Anchorage market that goes further in the afternoon. And I mean, is that an issue then? Say I pack something, moves to a different market later in the day.
have a permit for each market, and there's reasons for that, like I said, and one of them is logistically to schedule workers to make sure that we inspect everything. It's difficult to schedule inspectors if we don't know where they are. And so, and generally we want to make sure that we're inspecting these events and making sure that we're inspecting these vendors. Like I said, that the barrier of entry is lower. The education requirements are much lower. They only have to have a food worker card, and only one person in the booth has to have a food worker card, not all of them. And there's no requirement for an 8-hour ServSafe type registered food manager in a temporary food booth. All of those things a restaurant would have. And so with the education barrier lower, it requires us to be more and, you know, make sure that we inspect them more often to make sure that we don't run into problems. And we run into problems quite frequently, especially with new vendors. Now, we do have some vendors that have been doing this for years that we don't have a lot of problems with, but we have a lot of vendors who've been doing this for years that we have frequent problems with. And so if we don't know where they are, it's going to be hard for us to keep checking them and keep making sure that the public is safe.
Okay.
I could speak a bit to I guess I want to also clarify, we're talking about temporary permits right now, and there's the temporary permit and the temporary seasonal permit, which I just call the seasonal permit. I think for our purposes that works, which is the $230 on average permit. And then the temporary single event permit is that one that has that $35 to $75 range. Typically someone's going to get it for that $35 one-off. So those applications are virtually identical between the temporary permit and the temporary seasonal. And I think an important point here is that, like, in theory, that the code does an excellent job of kind of creating, oh, here, try this market, and then you can go on and do the seasonal if it works for you. But what we've seen is, you know, if someone wants to try a market, they just really want to try it once. Like I haven't worked with anybody that's done the 3 to 5 day or the 21 day $50 or $75 permit. It's really like, and that works the same way as an event organizer, where you have somebody, they might be early stage, and say, okay, try our market once. If that works well for you, or if that works well for us, you know, it has to be a mutual relationship there. We'd love to invite you back. And to be invited back, that immediately brings them into that $230 permit bracket. So essentially, we've had people who've wanted to sell and then say, oh yeah, come again. We would love to think about how to have you here again over the summer. And even if you're having a rotating cast of folks, say, hey, we have an opening in a month for another food booth. We would love to have you come. But they're essentially not able to do the same event twice in the year without kicking into that $230 permit. And that could be somebody, you know, we run a midweek market where somebody might have a staple booth at one market and wants to try Thursday sales mid-season. They really have their operation going and they can handle that. They're not able to really dip into that without significantly cutting into their margins. And then another element there is, well, I guess we could just like sit on that point. I think that one alone has caused people to walk away from market opportunities that really outside of the cost wouldn't be there. Like that barrier wouldn't be there.
Just for the record, that was Nick Bachman, right?
Yes, that was Nick.
Yeah, just folks sitting sure there. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I was clear on that. So someone could get a temporary permit to do a certain market, but if you do it a second time, you bump up to needing a seasonal. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that goes from your $35 to all of a sudden $230 for the next weekend.
Exactly.
Okay, I see Kirk's hand up.
I wanted to respond with an idea, and it might be a bad one, to Jeff's point about the need to inspect. And I think if you made a location agnostic seasonal permit, you could still schedule an inspection with an entrepreneur, for that first vending opportunity where they could tell you where they're going to be. But I guess I don't see that as a significant challenge to hopefully creating more opportunities for these small business owners.
All right, thank you. So Jeff, maybe more on that, because that seems to be an issue. How many inspectors do you have, and how many? So if someone does, one of these markets, and they're out there, even if they have a seasonal, they're at one location, and you want to inspect them. I mean, how often would someone be inspected?
We have throughout the summer season, we have 5 inspectors total to inspect 1,900 fixed facilities plus 500 plus temporary permits every year. And so every weekend of the summer, an inspector has a Saturday that they work. And then during that Saturday, they take all of the new events that are out there and they try to inspect all of those. And then when they're done with those, then they hit the markets and then go back over to the markets to maybe inspect the places that need a follow-up or had problems or issues to make sure that we're still being safe. And so it makes it a little harder for our inspectors to find that problem place if they've now moved markets and then they weren't planning to go to Spenard Market, but they can't find the guy that was at the Saturday market last week that needs to be, checked on again this week. It's just, it becomes a little bit more difficult for us, but and we've had that permitting structure in place for, I don't know, I've been here almost 20 years and it's predates me. So, and it's always worked before and we've never had issues with the structure. In fact, like I said, we've actually made it even easier. We've extended the dates and the market days from 2 days to 3 days so that we can accommodate Friday, Saturday, Sunday markets. So, if we want to revamp the entire fee structure and how we do things, it's going to be quite the undertaking for us to figure out how to do that.
Okay, but if it hinges on where finding the vendor, it seems like that, they can give you a schedule, and I mean, is that possible here? I'm, Joe's cake business.
But if they decide on Friday night that they've got a spot at the other market on Saturday and they go, we're not going to know that. It's not going to help us plan and schedule. That's kind of why each market has its own permit. So if you're at Spenard Market, we know you're at Spenard Market. When you start having multiple permits or a permit good at multiple locations, and we have had this happen before where somebody's got a retail mobile vendor permit, which is basically the truck with the freezer in it for selling meat and other stuff. And they'll set up the truck at Spenard Market, and then they'll set up a table with their stuff at a different market and try to run both on the same permit. So we have seen it with other types of permits. So I know that it would happen if we started to relax the location-based permitting system that we have in place. We don't let restaurants run with 2 permits or 1 permit for 2 locations. They have to have a separate permit for each location. And the temporary events have always been done that way, and it's an effective system of managing and tracking those permits. So I don't know how we could make it better, because once we start letting people get single day permits at the same location, the same event at the same location, multiple times, then you open up that door where they just run on single day or 21 day permits continually, rather than getting the appropriate level of permit that they need. So, because you have a higher level of requirements for a seasonal permit than you do for a single event permit. So, the standard goes up when you have a higher permit. And so the 1 to 21 day permits are meant to be single event permits. Park Strip, the 4th of July on the Park Strip, Juneteenth, the church car wash, things to that nature. Then when you get into the markets, if you're going to plan to be there more than 1 weekend, then we have a market permit, which is essentially the seasonal permit. And that's why that structure is set up, so that we can kind of keep this from turning into permanent businesses without without all the requirements that they're
perspective then, looking at the full spectrum of your permitting.
A brief reply there where the temporary and the seasonal are virtually the same application. There isn't a more robust application for the seasonal permit versus the temporary.
So I'm gonna jump in again. Hey Nick, when you talk, please say your name only because the record doesn't know who you are if the chair didn't call on you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I should.
My apologies.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are getting short on time. This is an interesting issue here. You can see the barriers, and just personally, I mean, I look back to 35 years ago, early in my business, and watched every $100 bill, was a big deal. And now we're really sloppy about that, but it's decades later. And we would set up, we didn't do food, but, paying market fees and so on, we watch those. It does make a difference, but public safety and then this incrementally moving on towards becoming a permanent restaurant, essentially, temporary permit by temporary permit certainly has legitimacy too. I don't know that we'll solve this now because we're running short, and I really appreciate that Michelle with the planning department is here, and I saw Ron Thompson too. So I wonder if I think we will have to continue this conversation. And maybe
Sure.
throw together some ideas, but I wonder if we can switch, unless someone has a question right now. I see Crystal in there. If we could switch and just, maybe a real quick statement from Michelle, say, have you looked at this and what will we do at a future meeting? But so go ahead, I guess first Crystal and then Chris, and then we'll get a word from Michelle.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I would just say that, I think we can probably work on this a little bit more and try to come up with some creative ideas. So I just would like to say that I think we need to continue the conversation. But also, I'm going to jump off here. I've got to get to another meeting, so I hate to leave early, but I need to do that. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Crystal. Chris?
Yeah, for my part, I'm hoping that Jeff Hickman, Darcy Harris, Nick Bachman, and Kirk Rose could separately meet, and maybe Michelle or her designee, and have an offline conversation, kind of a jazz session on how could we do better, that you guys collectively kind of bring forward some thoughts and ideas that are reality-based as opposed to from where we sit, because we're pretty far removed from all this, and we recognize there are some issues that could be resolved. And I think that having a small working group with those folks, if everyone were willing, might actually do a quantum leap more of good than we could in a 1 hour or 1 hour and a half session a few times at this level.
Yeah, I agree with that, Chris. And I can help facilitate that, I think. So thanks. So if we can move on real quick, Michelle, thank you for coming. We just have a few minutes, but if you could, has planning looked at this before? What's the status of these things for you?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for the invite. And thank you, Kirk, to you and your team for the overview. And I have to agree with others. This is an interesting topic. I've seen the letter that the Anchorage Community Land Trust sent over. I've seen that before. And it is something that we've looked on based on that. And I guess just in the spirit of what Christopher Constant just said, I would agree. I was going to actually suggest, I think we should sit down and talk about your analysis, because I'm curious if you guys have looked at hobby farms as an accessory use to in almost all of our residential districts, and home occupations, to see how that influences your kind of analysis if there's a shortage. I definitely am not objective or don't object to looking at the B1A and the B1B to see if, because I think those are the only two commercial zoning districts other than residential office that don't allow commercial horticulture. But I don't mind looking at the B1A and B1B, but I'm also wondering if there's not like a commercial horticulture light, and that it's a new use that's maybe more appropriate for these other zoning designations. And so I definitely think it warrants a conversation, but I'd really like to better understand your needs and the needs that you're seeing in the community so that we can appropriately put it into code. So just sounds like that's the spirit of everyone. So I'm in.
All right, thanks, Michelle. I think there was also an issue, I don't know if it was in the write-up, but Kirk had mentioned is parking requirements. So if you have a market like the one in Mountain View now, and you have a booth there to sell that's more than just a very short term, then now you have parking requirements that might be excessive too. And I know you're looking at changing parking requirements.
Yeah, and actually specifically in Mountain View and Fairview, we're looking at pretty significant reduction. So that's a great point. I think looking at all that in concert with each other, maybe the evaluation's different. Hopefully we've already taken the right steps in the right direction to start relieving this from a zoning challenge. So.
Okay, thank you. And Darcy put in the chat here that Health Department and ACLT have met multiple times to talk about these exact issues. So sometimes we talk things to death, but eventually something happens that works for everyone. And I know my experience with the Health Department on various issues is you guys have great patience and looking at these things and reacting to them. And I've appreciated that over the several years. So
John, if I might, Christopher here, I just would add a note to that those conversations have happened, great, and they'll happen again, great. But now there's a policy level conversation that's willing to proceed, and that may or may not have existed before. But the risk is the policymakers start making decisions without a very thoughtful input from the department and the affected individuals. And so I would much prefer to have this policy conversation informed by both the department and the proponents before we start jumping in, because there are many times when we do that, when we create secondary problems and make everyone go to their corners, and this is not the goal. The goal is to come up with some policy proposals that work for all the parties.
Right. That's always the goal. We do it better or worse, depending. And my experience with the health department is that they've been very, very patient and careful. And I think the changes we've made over the last few years appear to be working generally well. And we just need to see if there's a change in order here. So I think we are at the end of our time, and I think we have something coming up at 11-ish for the rest of us too. So we probably need to move on. So not anything else. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. We'll resume this some other day. Thanks. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.